Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, "You are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power."
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for our agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to support Freedom Now. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, March 8th, 2025. We begin with our sister Luyanda Kaboka, bringing us the African drumbeat historical calendar for the week, reminding us that every day is a day in African history. After that, our very own treasure trove of wisdom, author, historian, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer Dr. Gerald Horne, will be joined on the line by Gerald Goodwin, faculty member at Onondaga Community College in New York State, and author of the book Race in the Crucible of War, African American Servicemen and the War in Vietnam. Then in the second half of our program, Dr. Horne will be joined on the line by Leslie M. Alexander, Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of History at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And for our purposes today, she is co-editor of the book Ideas in Unexpected Places, Reimagining Black Intellectual History. But that's not all. We have even more in store for you as you hear from Kwaku Mintah Danquah, PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He'll be joining Dr. Horne to discuss a bit about his specialty, which is West African history. It'll be a densely packed morning of Pan-African knowledge you will not want to miss, so stay tuned and stay informed. Now I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom, right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. To make sure we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring the late great Roy Ayers, Jazz Crusaders, George Russell, Pearl Django, Joe Sample, and Black and White Crusaders. Now, people, get ready for this train coming, taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for that beat of the historical drum, followed by an interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor Gerald Goodwin.
Folks get brown in the sunshine.
Alafia. This is Sister Luyanda Koboka with Freedom Now's African Drumbeat Historical Calendar for the week of Tuesday, March 7th. We seek to immortalize our freedom fighters and our struggles by paying homage to them, giving life to those activities that move forward the inevitable march to the world based on human and spiritual values rather than profit, racism, and sexism. March 8th, 1820. Harriet Tubman, with a Bible and a gun, organizes hundreds of enslaved Africans through the Underground Railroad to freedom from chattel slavery. March 8th, 1928. Laura Kofi was the most successful Universal Negro Improvement Association organizer next to Marcus Mosiah Garvey. These two, with thousands of cadre globally, built the UNIA and African Communities League. The UNIA and ACL, with over 5 million disciplined members, was the largest global organization of Africans at home and in the diaspora. Their objective was the building of a unified Africa free from colonial and neo-colonial rule and the repatriation of all Africans in the diaspora to build Africa. March 9, 1898. Paul Robeson, singer, actor, athlete, scholar, and world-renowned revolutionary, was born. Paul Robeson was a leading spokesperson in the anti-capitalist, pro-socialist movement of the working class in general, and Africans in particular throughout Africa and the diaspora. March 10, 1977. Lumumbist forces begin armed class war against the neo-colonial fascist regime of Mobutu, financed by the US CIA and the host of right-wing European Christian fundamentalists. March 12, 1947. The United States proclaims itself the protector of the world from the working class ideologies of socialism with the Truman Doctrine. Though without the socialist bloc, the Nazis would have been undefeated. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics sacrificed 30 million Russians in major battles to defeat Nazi Germany. March 12, 1927. Minerva Mirabal, the oldest of 3 Mirabal sisters, Dominican women, who defied the Trujillo dictatorship and the United States invasion and occupation of their country. All 3 sisters were executed on November 25, 1960, due to their militant anti-U.S. colonial activism. March 12, 1791. Benjamin Banneker, one of the greatest African architects of his period, is commissioned to lay out the complete city and capital of the United States, the District of Columbia. March 13, 1979. The revolutionary forces of the New Jewel movement in Grenada, led by Maurice Bishop, overthrow the Uncle Tom government of Eric Gary, thereby bringing the people of Grenada free medical care, education, subsidized foods, housing, and pride in their government of Grenada, serving the people of Grenada and not the multinational food and spice corporations. March 14th, late 17th century. Tituba, African Native American healer from Barbados, persecuted as a witch due to her practice of traditional African culture, was the slave of a Salem Christian minister. Tituba shunned the Puritan lifestyle and religion and openly practiced her African medical cultural rituals and was much sought after as a healer. The 1692 hysterical witch hunts against women targeted her for hanging. We hope that this overview of the struggle of the oppressed against all forms of exploitation will place your activism within a long and glorious tradition of struggle and will incite those sitting on the sidelines to take up ideological and organizational weapons to smash the present regime of Bush and all his lackeys in the Democratic and Republican parties of the world. We will close out with our chant of unity from the struggles in Azania, South Africa. Amandla, you respond Awetu, which means the power to rule, the power of the land, the power of humankind is ours, the people. Amandla Awetu. Amandla Awetu. Amandla Awetu.
For Pacifica Radio, KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne. And with me on the line is Gerald Goodwin, a member of the faculty at Onondaga Community College in New York State, and author of the book, Race in the Crucible of War, African American Servicemen and the Vietnam War. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Gerald Goodwin.
Thank you for having me, Professor Horne. I really appreciate it. And I'm glad to be here.
And we're glad to have you. So why did you write this book?
I think whenever you approach a topic, at least for me as a historian, whenever I approach a topic, I think my interests do tend to go towards something that I have a personal connection to. And so my personal connection to this topic may be a bit different than other people. So both of my grandparents served in World War II. One was trained Black tank battalion at Fort Knox, Kentucky. And that was on my father's side of the family who grew up in Birmingham. My father actually grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. And so he, witnessed a lot of the racism that Black people experienced. But also from a perspective of a young person, he was kind of like, and you sometimes see this in studies and stuff of people who, I guess you would call them reconstructed Southerners, but who kind of saw what was happening in the society around him and didn't like it. And so I think he raised myself and my siblings with that in mind. And so there was that connection on that side of the family. On the other side of the family, my grandfather served in Germany in the European theater and had just a terrible experience. Was injured once. They did like mine detection, and so his job was to defuse munitions, and so he was badly injured once, sent back to the United States. They fixed him up and sent him back again. And the second time he was in the waning weeks of the war, he was ambushed and he was badly injured and permanently disabled. He was briefly captured by Nazi forces and interrogated. And so I think I was raised with kind of a different view of military service in terms of that it doesn't necessarily turn out good for every person. And there's not necessarily like the story of sort of the soldier, Marine, whatever, comes home and everyone celebrates them and their life is great. And it was such a positive impact on their life wasn't necessarily what I was taught growing up. And so I always had an interest in kind of civil rights, coming a little bit from both sides of the family. And then I had an interest in the Vietnam War. I grew up around a lot of Vietnamese refugees, so I kind of came from it from a different perspective initially. And so really, when I talk about my research and why I study what I do, I think there is a pretty strong relationship with that. I also grew up outside of the United States, so I had kind of a different perspective. And I also grew up in a multicultural environment, so I had a lot of experiences with different groups. And I think when you're in that environment and it's positive, you think kind of, okay, well, this is the way it is. But realistically, once I left that environment, I realized that not everybody had that perception. And so I think those two things collectively kind of led me to wanting to study racial issues and then having the military background and just an overall interest in civil rights.
Where outside the United States did you grow up?
I actually grew up in Ottawa, Canada. So
I see.
Both my parents are American immigrants. So my father's family is from, like I said, the South, and my mother's family is more from like the Midwest, but she lived all over the country. So she had a lot of experiences growing up where, she would live in one place and it was totally segregated, and then she would live in another place and it was an integrated school. So, I think those kind of experiences really formulated my research interest in general.
Mm-hmm. Now, give us some numbers with regard to the percentages of Black servicemen who served in Vietnam. What was the time frame that you deal with? What was their casualty rates, percentage-wise, et cetera? Sure.
So it kind of and it fluctuates a lot, and so part of what you kind of have to realize when studying this topic too is because of that fluctuation, people could be coming from it from a different perspective, right? So the total number in the whole conflict is African Americans roughly served a little bit over the percentage of the population. And that's the same with the casualty rates. It's about similar, almost the same. But in the early years of the war, they served in much higher numbers, and both percentage-wise, and then that obviously led to a higher casualty rate as well. So you kind of have to separate the conflict between kind of 65 to 67, and then the rest of the war. But one thing that I found that's kind of interesting about that is that this often leads people to kind of almost be dismissive of a lot of the complaints that existed early in the war, which are verified by the numbers that they were serving in disproportionate numbers, and they were serving in combat in disproportionate numbers, and then they were being killed in disproportionate numbers. But a lot of times people will kind of use the overall rate to then go, well, it wasn't that bad, right? But from a person who was Black and serving in 1966, they did serve in a military force that was disproportionately Black. It's also important, I think, when looking at these numbers, to think about the fact that African Americans were also serving in a military and representing a country that was not representing them at home. So even if the numbers were just slightly overall for the conflict, they also weren't necessarily benefiting or getting anything particular for serving, right? So, and that can sometimes be kind of also a mistake of how historians or just people in general look at it, which, this is a different war. It's not a previous conflict where you have this sort of idea of, fighting for citizenship or things like that, which, I would argue thinking of it like that is problematic anyways, because African Americans, deserve equal rights, equality by act of being human, not because they serve in the military at these numbers or those numbers or any other percentage like that. So the numbers are in the earlier years of the conflict, they are pretty high for death rates up to 20%. But they do fall partially through intervention of the government, who they both sort of deny the fact that these numbers matter, but then behind the scenes kind of go, well, this makes us look very bad. So the numbers do change. Actually, the numbers in combat don't change that much. They actually go up in certain places. But yeah, so that's kind of like a rough estimate. The first part of the conflict, they're higher than a percentage of the population. The second part of the conflict, they go much lower, or not much lower, but they go lower. And then for overall, it's roughly representative, but that doesn't speak to the full story.
During this war, were there examples and cases of interracial conflict? For example, soldiers on the U.S. side fighting each other?
Yes, so that's a large contribution that my work has provided for the field. Is conflict was pretty constant in post 68. No, I would argue, and I do argue, there's numerous reasons for that. I think you can look at it as a reaction to particular moments. So a major moment would be the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., which led to considerable racial tension and violence in the United States, and it had that same impact in Vietnam. But it's also kind of a sort of a slow boil of longstanding problems and tensions that existed, not necessarily just between Black and white troops, but also between African Americans and the military system in general. So complaints about being discriminated in a variety of different categories, like the justice system, the promotion system, just the fact that so many African Americans were sent into combat in the first place. That was kind of led to over time, the military's failure to address those issues, I think, became more and more problematic. Then as the war continued on. So really by 68, I would say late 68, definitely into 69 and 70, violence is one of the largest problems the military faces, violence between African Americans and whites. And it doesn't always break down exactly like that, but you just have hundreds, really thousands of incidents of racial violence from that time period.
Was there any influence of the Black Panther Party on Black soldiers during this conflict?
That's a really interesting question, because I think I went in to the research thinking that there would be, but I came out thinking I think it's a little more complex than people But I would say that people give credit to. What I would say is that the Black Power movement had an influence, but it was often through language, through sort of cultural practices, not necessarily like the ideological arguments that particular Black Power groups were using. So things like Black Power salutes, dapping, which is pretty common nowadays, comes from Black Vietnam, Black service members in Vietnam, and so there were those outward signs of Black Power that were fairly prevalent in Vietnam. There were organizations in Vietnam of both Black organizations and organizations that were sympathetic, let's say, to Black service members. But there's not a lot of evidence that, other than you hear references, like a few references here or there to Black Panther Party members, but generally then you hear other people say, well, they weren't really a Black Panther Party member. Additionally, it's a little problematic because the Black Panther Party, at least at different times, expressed certain ideas that the average Black service member wouldn't appeal to them. So what I would say is Black Power definitely had an influence over Black forces in Vietnam. But they also had their own organizations. So there was numerous different groups that they formed themselves to represent Black service members specifically.
Were those the United States was fighting? Did they aim propaganda at Black servicemen?
Were the Vietnamese? Is that the question?
Yes, they were fighting the Vietnamese.
Yeah,
so I'm asking, were the Vietnamese targeting?
Sorry, I didn't hear that first word. So I was fighting. Okay, yes. So, and the Vietnamese had kind of a history of doing this because they also appealed to the French on racial grounds, really depending on who they were talking to. So they would sometimes use actually racist propaganda to try to discourage the French from fighting, and also encourage Vietnamese people from resisting the French, who used a lot of African colonial forces. And so, yes, they use this continually against Black forces in Vietnam through pamphlets, radio propaganda, all sorts of different sources, which kind of all presented it in the same way. The message was essentially, you're Black, you're being mistreated in the United States. The real war for African Americans is at home. And so you being sent to Vietnam is just distracting you from what the real conflict is at home. Within this, they also would often show empathy and at least a rudimentary knowledge of race relations in the United States. It wasn't necessarily complex, but they would often reference things like Alabama, or the police brutality, the mistreatment of someone. And so they used our own fractured race relations in the United States for their own benefit. Now, their goal was kind of to get African Americans just to outright quit. Now, that didn't necessarily happen in great numbers, but it did lead African Americans to develop maybe a more complex view of the war, and in many cases have some sympathy for the Vietnamese that they were fighting.
What was the long-term impact on the U.S. military of this interracial conflict and of the way the war was conducted in general?
Yeah, I think especially based on everything that military leaders were saying at the time period, and some of them were trying to kind of cover this up as a problem, and so there's a lot of inconsistency in the military's official reports. But it was clear that they understood that this was just a drastic problem, that this was something that couldn't continue long term, and really that you couldn't win the war, or really any war, with having this kind of a fractured military. And so, sometimes they would outright blame the troops, but oftentimes they did have at least some sort of basic understanding that how can you win this conflict when you're fighting amongst yourselves. And so long term, in the short term, they did try to implement numerous sort of programs that were based in greater racial understanding and education. Now, some of those things were more effective than others because often you needed kind of all different ranks to follow through with those. And even though I think there were some people higher up in the military who were genuine in their appreciation for greater diversity and those types of questions, a lot of the ranking officers weren't. So I think probably the reality is, in order to actually create a more parity in the system, you couldn't be doing this under the conditions of a conflict. So you see greater success with those programs once the war is actually over. And really, the fighting itself really only dies down because the American commitment to the conflict dies down. So as fewer people are being sent to Vietnam, there's less conflict. But it's a little hard to tell what kind of impact larger the programs have. So I can recall I tell a story in the book, which comes from the Black Journal, which is really an important source of information from that period. And they interview a few, I think they're members of the Navy, and they talk to them about their participation in some of these committees. And one guy sort of says, like, we kept going to the committee, and we're supposed to be meeting with white representatives, and they would just never show up. And so he puts it as, that his suspicion was really these groups were just to almost locate African Americans who are interested in this stuff and then label them troublemakers. Now, I don't think that's the only reason, but certainly that could have happened, and they were right to be suspicious of that, frankly.
Well, Gerald Goodwin, member of the faculty at Onondaga Community College in New York State, author of the book Race in the Crucible of War, African American Servicemen in the Vietnam War. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is your sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne. And with me on the line is Leslie M. Alexander, Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of History at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and co-editor of the book Ideas in Unexpected Places, Reimagining Black Intellectual History. Thank you for joining us on KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Alexander.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's always good to be in conversation with you.
Ditto. So why did you co-produce this book?
Yeah, this book actually came out of a conference in association with the African American Intellectual History Society, a conference that was actually held several years ago now. And one of the things that conference and the collection of people attending were really trying to do is, as you see by the title, Ideas in Unexpected Places, we are trying to push the boundaries of what we mean by intellectual history. As I'm sure you know, for a long time, traditionally speaking, intellectual history has been sort of viewed as the realm of sort of ancient European thinkers like Plato and Socrates, right? Aristotle, people who had the luxury to be able to ponder life's big ideas and concepts. And one of the things we really wanted to do with this book is to push back against those boundaries and to challenge the question of what does it mean to be an intellectual? And in what way can everyday people actually be profound and intellectual thinkers, even if their ideas are not always held up and celebrated in the way that traditional intellectuals have been?
So this volume seeks to make a contribution to sexuality studies. Talk to us about that, and perhaps you can allude to the contribution by Deidre Cooper Owens and her concept of soul care.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we really wanted to do with this project, again, is to really think in creative ways about all of the people that are intellectuals, all of the people who are making political and intellectual contributions. And I think in today's society, we think a lot about the importance of self-care and about Black joy and all of these concepts that previous generations have not given a lot of credence or attention to. But one of the things that Deidre Cooper Owens was doing in her piece, and I think a number of people in the volume were trying to do, is to think in more profound and significant ways about the ways in which there is an intellectual, an emotional, a political service that is rendered when people are actually trying to attend to people's hearts, to their bodies, to their souls in really profound and important ways.
So this volume also seeks to make a contribution to the field of Black internationalism, particularly the role of Haiti in the Haitian Revolution. Could you brief us on that?
Yes, absolutely. So again, we wanted to challenge people to think about the way Black people across time and across space have really contributed to international, transnational, Pan-African political and intellectual conversations. Both myself and one of the other co-editors, Brandon Byrd, were people who had worked quite a bit on Haiti and the relationship between Black activists in the United States and Haiti. And then our third editor, Russell Rickford, had also worked on Black transnational Pan-Africanist movements and ideologies. And so we have a number of chapters in the volume that are looking at the relationship between Black activists in the US and Haiti, looking at Liberia, looking at Guyana, trying to think really creatively about how everyday people are building Pan-Africanist connections and coalitions across national boundaries, and are doing it in time periods that we often don't take seriously as moments where Black people are political thinkers.
So you mentioned your co-editor, Russell Rickford, who has a forthcoming book on the relationship between Black Americans in Guyana, the only English-speaking nation in South America,
yes,
on the northern coast of that continent. Are you able to give us a synopsis of what he had to contribute with regard to that forthcoming book? And also you could elaborate on what the volume says about Liberia as well.
Yes, absolutely. So I probably can't say too much about what Russell is saying in the forthcoming book, although I feel like we do get a little snapshot of it in the chapter. I think, like a lot of people, I'm anxiously anticipating to see his book in print. But what I can say is that one of the things that he was trying to do, and I think he did quite effectively in the chapter that he contributed to this book, is to kind of challenge us to rethink what we thought we knew about Jonestown. and the role of Black activists in the development of that settlement in Guyana. Obviously, there has been lots of lore surrounding what took place at Jamestown and the community that people were building there. But I think one of the things that Russ was really trying to do with this chapter, and I imagine that the book is going to be building on this same concept, is to really sort of rethink who were the radical Black thinkers and activists who were trying to create an alternative kind of society and an alternative kind of community when they went down and settled in Guyana. Obviously, the settlement ended up going sideways, right? But I think he's actually trying to challenge us to think about what was the original vision and what was the original purpose of the people who went there.
Now, for those who may not recall, it was about 45 odd years ago that a number, particularly of Black people from the San Francisco Bay Area, migrated to Guyana to establish this settlement. And by dint of both suicide and homicide, that's where the phrase drinking the Kool-Aid comes from, which we often use metaphorically, there was this mass slaughter that attracted global attention and continues to attract attention. But let's shift gears. Your book also tries to make a contribution to digital humanities. What are digital humanities, and what is the contribution that your volume makes to this field?
Yes, I think this is actually a really important development that's been taking place in the humanities over the past 10 years or so. I think for a long time, people imagined that those of us who are working in history or literature or philosophy were far separated away from the world of technology. And what digital humanities is really trying to do is to bring those of us who work in the area of humanities into conversation with people who are in the types of STEM fields, right, that tend to be the most expansive and dynamic in this day and age. And so digital humanities is really all about thinking about ways, creative ways that we can use technology, whether it be databases, whether it be archives, whether it be making resources more accessible to the public. How can we use technology as a way to expand people's access and information to the knowledge that we have access to in the humanities?
So, Professor Alexander, you recently published a book on Haiti and the Haitian Revolution. Yeah. And I'm wondering, what do your readers have to look forward to in terms of your future research?
It's actually interesting because, as you said, my most recent book is actually a study that looks at Black activism in the 19th century and trying to draw the connections between the relationship between Black activists in the US and Haiti during that period. For my next project, I'm actually switching gears and going in a very different direction. I'm actually modeling myself a little bit after you, Gerald. And I'm looking at, I'm basically doing a deep dive into really kind of understanding the origins of policing in Black communities. So it's a project that starts in the colonial period, from the very founding of what becomes the United States, right? The original British 13 colonies in mainland North America, and is looking at how policies and practices of surveillance, of monitoring, of punishment evolve into what we understand now to be modern day policing.
Finally, Professor Alexander, MLK Professor of History at Rutgers University in New Jersey, co-editor of the book Ideas in Unexpected Places, Reimagining Black Intellectual History. For the youth in our audience, would you recommend that they come to New Jersey to study with yourself and like-minded scholars?
I absolutely would. I certainly hope that they do. I have to say I was raised in California myself, so I understand how difficult it is to leave the great state of California. But I would certainly encourage people to, like the title indicates, expand the boundaries, right, of your existence, of your imagination, envision yourself in a new place, in a new environment. The East Coast has a lot to offer in terms of culture, in terms of community. And at Rutgers in particular, we right now have the #1 ranked African American history program in the country. We have a wide variety of scholars who are exploring the African diaspora, African American descended experience throughout the world in lots of different time periods, looking at it in lots of different ways. We have an amazing community of people who are always eager to work with new young students.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Leslie M. Alexander, MLK Professor of History at Rutgers University, co-editor of the book Ideas in Unexpected Places. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thanks for having me.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Kwaku Mintah Danquah, PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin and Madison, who specializes in researching West African history. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Danquah.
Thank you so much, Professor Gerald Horne. I'm happy to have this conversation with you.
Ditto. So, who was Chief Alfred Sam, and how does he figure into your research?
Okay, so Chief Alfred Sam was a Gold Coast entrepreneur. He was a businessman. He was born in the 1890s. And he was trained by the Basel missionaries in the Gold Coast. Alfred Sam was trained originally to become a catechist. So he was trained by the missionaries, giving literary education, but he had his interest elsewhere. He developed interest in trade. So he was interested in the cocoa boom, which occurred in the Gold Coast in the 1890s, early 20th century, and was also interested in timber trade, which was thriving in the Gold Coast, and not only in the Gold Coast, but also across West Africa. So by 1900s, Chief Alfred Sam decided to expand his business beyond the shores of what we now know as Ghana. Alfred Sam had connections to Liberia, was extending his timber and cocoa trade to all these places. And then by 1911, he decided to expand his business beyond West Africa into America. So that's where he formed the Akim Trading Company in 1911. And that's where ideas about repatriation began. So in simple terms, Alfred Sam was a Gold Coast entrepreneur who looked beyond the Gold Coast to think about ideas about repatriation in the early 20th century.
So what attracted him to Oklahoma, of all places?
Yeah, so Alfred Sam from the beginning was not interested in Oklahoma. He was based in New York. That's where the Akim Trading Company was based. Now, one of the key ideas about his earlier company was to purchase land where he could expand his business in West Africa. And actually purchased the land, 64-acre land in the Gold Coast, in modern the Gold Coast. Now, Sam published this purchase in newspapers in West Africa. And again, if you look at newspapers were circulated not only in West Africa, but also towards the United States. And African Americans in Oklahoma saw this and got interested in Sam's venture. So it was because of this that Sam got the idea to now think about forming or creating a repatriation scheme to repatriate African Americans back to the Gold Coast. So what attracted him was because of the existing interest of people of Oklahoma to repatriate. So somehow to change his business venture to include repatriation, when he got this interest or invitation shown by people of Oklahoma to now repatriate people to the Gold Coast. Yeah.
Is it fair to infer that the Black people in Oklahoma wanted to leave that state and go to Africa because of the problems and terror that they were facing in Oklahoma?
Yeah, so far the records indicates that there were already ongoing conversations about where to go, or ideas about repatriation was already in vogue. But the question was where to go and how to go. So some schemes seem to be a perfect fit to answer these questions for people of African Americans in Oklahoma. So again, this was one of the responses towards the general conditions of African Americans in the United States of America. That was a period where the Jim Crow was at its peak, I would say, the early 20th century, late 19th century. So for me, it would be a fair assessment that if you're thinking about the reasons why Oklahomans became interested in this scheme, we could point to the general climate, the general racial environment within the United States in the early 20th century.
Do you have any idea about how many Black people from Oklahoma wound up moving to the Gold Coast? And if so, do their descendants continue to reside there?
So the records are a bit sketchy. I mean, I've relied so far on colonial records from Ghana newspapers. And what I have now on record is 64 African Americans who moved from Oklahoma to the Gold Coast. And of course, the 64 were supposed to be the pioneers. They were supposed to go to the Gold Coast and then look at the conditions and come back and then bring the general mass of people to the Gold Coast. And of course, and the records indicate that more than 200 people were interested in this scheme. And yeah, so that's it for the question of the numbers. But in terms of the descendants, I think recent studies have been trying to trace the history of the descendants of African Americans who went to Oklahoma. I think recent studies by Ken Rafford and Ebony Colette who have been trying to do this work, and it's been very difficult to trace the descendant because those who stayed kind of assimilated within the society in the Gold Coast. Others also moved to Nigeria. I've seen newspaper records which shows families lived in Nigeria, but I'm yet to follow on the sources of Nigeria to kind of trace the descendants of African Americans who moved to West Africa. So far, the records does not give us a lot to say about the descendants now, but I think the work which has been done so far shows that there were others who stayed and others who moved back to the United States when the scheme failed.
So, Professor Danquah, you're also conducting research about the Kru people, KRU, of what is now Liberia. Tell us about that project and also inform us about how they clashed, or got along for that matter, with the community known as the Americo-Liberians. That is to say, the folk from the United States who approximately 200 years ago began streaming into West Africa and led to the formation of the state we now know as Liberia.
Okay, yeah. So thank you so much. So my research, my current PhD research is on the history of the transnational politics of Kru people who are indigenous to what we now know as Liberia, which was also known as the Grain Coast in those days. Now, the Kru people were a mobile people, so they traversed not only West Africa but also in the Atlantic. They usually worked with European ships, so they worked in as crew members of European ships, and so with the coming of what we now know as the Americo-Liberians, one of the key issue was to try again. Liberia was more or less a struggling economy because they relied on rubber at a point, and then that demand dropped, and then the demand moved to human labor. Now again, so they didn't labor within the country itself. Americo-Liberian regime was trying to limit the movement of Kru people across West Africa, and these Kru people were working with other European merchants in West Africa. So they were working with the British in West Africa, the French, and also the Germans. Now, this created a kind of friction between Americo-Liberians and then the Kru people. And interestingly, indigenous Africans in Liberia did not have citizenship and voting rights until 1910, until the first decade of the 20th century. And again, the reason why they granted citizenship was to be able to make claims, because Britain and France was making claims towards Liberian lands, and one way to assert autonomy over these places was to grant citizenship to indigenous people. Now, my research studies how the Kru people counteracted Americo-Liberian hegemony through British imperial spaces. So again, I'm looking at how the Kru people created alliances with the British to challenge Americo-Liberian regime. And again, it kind of complicates our idea about racial solidarity, especially in West Africa. So I'm looking at how the creation of the Liberian states kind of brought up these dynamics about fissures between different black subjectivities, and in this line between African Americans or Americo-Liberians, which again I need to point out was comprised not only African Americans but also Caribbean migrants, especially from Barbados, right? Who make up these elites in Liberia. So that is what I am interested in.
Well, just a footnote. Have you detected any conflicts between and amongst the migrants from Barbados compared to the so-called African Americans from North America, or did they get along?
Okay, so I think there've been some studies to answer that question. I think the recent study is by Professor Carrie Banton, and she studies the Barbadians, and she argues that there's been some kind of differences in ideas, because Barbados was also a British colony, and the ideas about empire more or less conflicted with African American ideas about republicanism, right? Yeah, but it was not as obvious as the conflict between what we lumped together and called the Americo-Liberian elites and the Africans, which I study.
Mm-hmm. Now, Americo-Liberian rule in Liberia has been analogized by some to settler colonialism, which is practiced here in North America, or to apartheid, once practiced in South Africa. Are those apt analogies?
Okay, I've received that question, but I think it would be an oversimplification to characterize what happened in Liberia as apartheid, because they have their own historical differences. So, for example, in terms of the Americo-Liberian elites, the kind of arguments and claims that we're making towards Liberia was far different from the kind of claims that the British and the Afrikaners made in South Africa. The exclusion and conflicts might be very similar, but for me, I think they occurred in different circumstances. and should not be summarily described as apartheid, because American Liberians were making claims towards African ancestry, an idea of African return, which was different from the ideas which the British and then Afrikaner made in South Africa. So I think it would be an oversimplification to characterize what happened in Liberia as apartheid, even though I talk about the kind of conflict and oppression that indigenous Africans endured in Liberia.
And what about the analogy to settler colonialism?
For settler colonialism, I think the analogy fits. It fits for especially in the 19th century and the 20th century, again, because we see how American Liberians were making claims towards land, right, which kind of took away lands and opportunities for indigenous people in Liberia, right? So the idea of settler colonialism, I think, better describes the situation in Liberia than the idea of apartheid.
Mm-hmm. Finally, Professor Danquah, graduate student in the doctoral program at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, what is the timetable for completion of these projects you just outlined?
Okay, so with the Chief Sam project, I would be I'm rewriting it. I presented it at the American Historical Association in January. So I'm rewriting it as an article, and I'm hoping to publish it at the Journal of African American Studies somewhere at the end of this year or early next year. And I'm not a PhD candidate, so my main project is on the Kru history in West Africa, and hopefully I'll be going to the field in May, and I'll come back. I'll be going to Liberia, I'll be going to Sierra Leone, I'll be going to Ghana and London. So I'll be done with all that by next year, 2026, and then hopefully the writing should be done by the end of 2027. So I have a couple of time to deal with my main dissertation project.
Well, we all look forward with eager anticipation to the publication of these works. Professor Danquah, thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for having me.
Sunshine. Everybody loves the sunshine. Sunshine.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, Gerald Goodwin from Onondaga Community College, Leslie M. Alexander from Rutgers University, and Kwaku Mintah Danquah representing the University of Wisconsin. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Word to producer Sister Tej. Special thanks to Sister Louiana Kavoka on the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar, as well as to our spiritual backbone, Freedom Now founder and ancestor Babadidan Kamathi. Abundant thanks to our marvelous engineer, and last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org, or go to our audio archives at kpfk.org, scroll down to find Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa, coming up next, addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.